In this video, I have another question from Instagram, and the person asking the question wants to know, how can I tell the difference between INTJ and ENTJ? Starting with INTJ, this is the type of person that engages in frequent reflection on technical information. This person may give you the impression that they're very withdrawn and introspective a good amount of the time. And with that being said, this person also has a very practical bent. So while they're very introspective, the things that they're mulling over are generally going to be in the form of something that you can read in a manual or a textbook or probably an academic journal. So most of the time, that's typical behavior from someone that's INTJ, is self-reflecting on things that they've read. The other side to them that you'll see when they're being a little bit more creative and freeform is discussion of ideas that really aren't that focused. So they like to play around with different ideas. And in these cases, you'll notice that they're using their own logical rules rather than things that they've read in a book. When you're speaking to someone that's INTJ, you'll notice that they are not very emotionally expressive all of the time. In fact, you'll notice that they have a bit of a problem being emotionally expressive when it's appropriate to do so. And because of that, they like to keep conversation on thinking terms. So instead of giving someone an appeal to their emotions, they'll try to appeal to logic, and they'll try to reason with someone in a very structured way. This behavior can seem kind of absurd, so it'll really stand out to you when you're talking to someone that's INTJ, because they'll even try to be logical about assessing other people's emotions, which doesn't really make sense. So they're trying to make sense of something, and in the process, they're not making sense. This is nonsensical, at least in emotional terms. So, in other words, what the person is saying might make sense on paper, but in a social situation might not make much sense. If you've known this person for a while, or you've observed them in a variety of different circumstances, you'll notice that someone that's usually very withdrawn and matter of fact becomes a little bit more playful and a little bit more exploratory with what they're talking about. And what I mean here is that you'll observe someone that is withdrawn and introspective, but they're introspective about certain things a lot of the time. And they usually shirk off other people's ideas and ideas that they don't think will be practical. But when they're not very withdrawn and still speaking about abstractions, they seem very energized when they're generating new ideas. And there's going to be a very strong contrast in these situations between when the person is very energized and they might be all over the place seemingly with what they're talking about, but they'll bring it back down. And so this is like maybe 95% of the time in these situations, they're being very creative with their idea and it's very abstract, but then they're going to try to accommodate whoever they're talking to. So they might make a joke, or they might keep the ideas on some terms that other person is used to, even though they were talking about something that is not very commonplace to be speaking about. To recap, when you're observing someone that's INTJ, you're going to be looking for someone that engages in frequent reflection on technical information. Upon closer inspection, you'll notice that someone that is very practical and withdrawn and introspective becomes someone that enjoys telling captivating stories and using new ideas, and particularly logical ideas, to entertain other people. The bullseye here is that, along with the other observations I've listed before, this person is going to be very matter of fact and generally will avoid very pronounced emotional expression. Again, we're going to be looking for someone that is very frequently engaged in self-reflection on practical information and information that can be used to drive productivity. Other facets of behavior that we're looking for here are someone that is not very adept at emotional expression, someone that's very matter of fact, and also someone that likes to engage in free-form, creative discussion using their own logic. With that being said, the celebrities for INTJ we're going to be looking at in this video are Isaac Asimov, biochemist and writer Isaac Asimov, and Christopher Hitchens, journalist and writer Christopher Hitchens.
They'll go for the certainty, even if it's wrong. It depends on what you promise. Why do people go out and buy fake oil stock of all kinds? Con men always get rich. They sell people all kinds of ridiculous things. They play all kinds of games which just take money away. Why? Because in each case they promise that the person will make a lot of money. And the eagerness to get rich easy, the get-rich-quick schemes that people fall for, is what they lose money over. Well, this is a kind of a get-rich-quick scheme of the mind. These are con men of the spirit, if you will. They're selling you something, a false security that sounds good, knowledge of the future that doesn't really exist, assurance that you'll be safe when you're not really safe, and you give them all the money you can in return for it. Same thing like betting which pea is under which shell.
Then people complain that politics is too bland, that politics is too samey, politics is too boring. If you ask, say, a Ross Perot supporter, wake him up if you have to. No, don't. Just stop him or her on the street and say, don't you think that parties in America spend much too much time bickering among themselves rather than getting on with the nation's business? There's too much partisanship. The person will say yes. I'll guarantee that he will. Leave a few more questions in between so the trick isn't too obvious, and then ask him, don't you think the two major parties are much too much alike? He will infallibly reply yes to that too. And in fact, it's very unclear very often when you have movements that say they want a third party. It's very unclear to many people why they always fail. One reason why they always fail is we don't yet have two parties. So third party movements, I think, will fail by definition.
By contrast to someone that is INTJ, someone that's ENTJ is thinking dominant. So thinking dominant as opposed to intuition dominant. These people really gravitate towards situations in which they're unhindered in making practical decisions. Something that you'll notice with these people is that they value productivity for productivity's sake. That's the impression that you're going to get when you're around these people. In that way, the first thing you're going to notice about someone that's ENTJ over someone that's INTJ is that they're not going to be as withdrawn. You will notice that they do like to self-reflect. However, it's a lot less, like their self-reflections are a lot less rampant than someone that's INTJ. And they don't take place all the time. They're not so obsessed and they're not so heavily engaged in their own self-reflections as someone that's INTJ. They're going to have more practical purposes for their self-reflection. In other words, you'll notice that someone that's ENTJ is generally going to be mulling over information for practical purposes rather than someone that's INTJ that's mulling over information just because it happens to be practical. And that's what's going to be most apparent about these people, is that they're generally trying to increase the productivity of whatever they're involved in. And if they're self-reflecting or they're mulling over something, it's generally something that they already have considered to be something that's going to increase productivity. If you've known someone of this psychological type for a while, or you've seen them in a variety of different circumstances and environments, you'll notice that occasionally they like to be involved in detailed logical deliberation while talking about things that are less concrete. Here we're talking about people that are interested in the efficiency of methodologies and the practicality of different technical methods on a very deep level. In this sense, people of this psychological type are going to want to make sure that they get the full logical picture when they're directing activity. And it's kind of funny because they're very focused and serious people, but from time to time they like to consider different perspectives and different alternative ideas to their own that might seem far-fetched And this generally comes with a lack of convenience in the ways that they like to improve how productive something is. In other words, you'll get the sense that the things that they say and the things they suggest aren't necessarily suggested for the purpose of making something less complicated or making an idea less complicated. It's more about making something more practical and fleshing something out in thinking terms. Another facet of behavior with ENTJs is that you'll notice that they like to be very thorough and strict in how they coherently reason things out. And going along with that, they like to reason out unpopular opinions and consider different ideas from a detached perspective. The major difference here that you're going to notice between someone that's ENTJ and someone that's INTJ is that someone that's ENTJ is going to give off the impression that they're more thorough in their thinking. In other words, it'll look like they're taking a longer time to come to an emotional conclusion on something. So in terms of emotionalism, there's very stark contrast between when someone that's ENTJ is being very strict and regimented in logical deliberation and when they're romanticizing something that they're talking about. In this way, they seem a little bit more open in social terms than someone that's INTJ. And this is because you'll very rarely hear someone that's ENTJ talk about things in romanticized terms, but someone that's INTJ, it will seem like, or they'll give the impression that they'll do this less often than someone that's ENTJ. To recap, in typing someone that is ENTJ, you're looking for someone that is frequently engaged in practical decision-making, guided by self-reflection. You're also looking for someone that doesn't mind occasionally engaging in detailed logical deliberation on things that are hypothetical. And they'll give the impression that they're a very far-sighted person that doesn't really stress too much emphasis on convenience. For the ENTJ clips in this video, the celebrities are comedian and sports commentator Joe Rogan, as well as entrepreneur and biochemist Craig Venter.
How much of you subscribes to the idea that what we're looking at is some sort of a chemical gateway?
Chemical gateway to
what? Whatever it is. To whatever that DMT experience is. That this is something that your brain has the ability to travel to. But, I mean, since we know that the body does produce this, and we know that it's possible for people to, I mean, I've never done it, but I know that people who do Kundalini yoga have apparently reported trip-like experiences that are very similar to a real DMT flash.
Mm-hmm.
So the mind has this ability to do this on its own. What do you think that is that something worth considering, that this is some sort of a pathway to a nearby dimension or to something that's around us all the time but we just don't have access to with normal neurochemistry?
You know, there's
is it too many what ifs or who knows?
No, I mean there's
There are a lot of people in this country who don't think that you ought to screw around with nature. We don't have too many choices now. We are a society that is 100% dependent on science. We're going to go up in our population in the next 40 years. We can't deal with the population we have without destroying our environment. But aren't you playing God? We're not playing anything. We're understanding the rules of life.
But that's more than studying life. That's changing life.
Well, domesticating animals was changing life. Domesticating corn. When you do crossbreeding of plants, you're doing this blind experiment where you're just mixing DNA of different types of cells and just seeing what comes out of it.
This is a little different, though. This is another step, isn't it?
Yeah, now we're doing it in a deliberate design fashion with tiny bacteria. I think it's much healthier to do it based on some knowledge and a better understanding of life than to do it blindly and randomly.